Welcome everyone, good morning, evening and afternoon to this edition of Izen in the Dark. Today is the 22nd of December, and today, as I am sure all of our dear weebs know very well, 134 years ago we got our first Prime Minister of Japan. Now, what is interesting about this Prime Minister is that he was the first samurai who got in government as the head of office, Ito Hirobumi. Now, of course, being a samurai, he must have done many important and successful things. No, he didn't. He was deposed after like 14 months, actually ended up in shame and failure. But hey, it is still remembered as the first Prime Minister of Japan. Now, talking about firsts, today we have our first week of Dragonflight Season 1 Mythic Plus with Tyrannical. And in the meantime, what happened from last week, from our fortified week, was a whole bunch of nerfs throughout this reset coming live for this week of Mythic Plus. So let's go over a bunch of these changes to the dungeons, then we talk a little bit more about the dungeons themselves, how difficult they have been. Let's start with the nerfs, first of all. Nerf number 1 is to Algethar Academy. Now, looking at Algethar Academy, especially if you have watched my stream where I went on a beautiful 0-for-7 success rate on the first part of the dungeon, the hardest part was the tree boss and of course the trash surrounding the tree boss, in particular one trash surrounding the tree boss, this motherfucker right here. So, aggravated skitterfly darting sting, which is the dash he does to random enemies, has been reduced by 25%, which is a good start, but more importantly, should now try to sting different targets. This was the biggest issue, not much the charge itself, which was chunking players down to 40-ish%, maybe even 30 or 20% when they were enraged. The bigger problem was that there is 3 of them during the charges at very similar times. So if 2 of them ended up going on the same target, that target was going to die instantly. So let's hope that this one is going to prevent them from just charging the same player multiple times in a row, because that would usually spell certain death. So that's the first good change. Then the other change to Algethar Academy is that the overgrown ancient, the tree boss, has its big tree add, the ancient branch. The health of the ancient branch has now been reduced by 40%. This is of course very good because this was the most dangerous part of the encounter. The more it took to kill him, the more dangerous it would become, etc, etc. So now with a cut in HP by 40%, it is making it definitely a more manageable of a fight. Still a difficult one, especially this week in Tyrannical with Grievous as well. Of course, it is still going to be quite the challenge. There are no other nerfs to Algethar Academy, which is okay, it's understandable. It's not that most of the other enemies in Algethar Academy were that annoying. It was mostly about the first boss and the surrounding trash. So, okay changes to this dungeon. Let's move on to Azure Vault. Conjured Lasher health reduced by 20%. These are the little plants that do Mystic Vapors. The cast which will put the dot on all of your party, hitting quite a bit, and it can stack to multiple times if you don't interrupt or stop them from casting it. So, now, nerfing their HP by 20% is going to make them cast this less, because if you die, you can't cast things. That apparently is a thing in World of Warcraft, so good nerf to the Conjured Lashers. Arcane Tender's infused ground damage has been reduced by 33%. Now, this is not a type of mob you will be fighting often, and also in not that difficult and dangerous of situations. That room is quite empty, it's quite easy to move around, it's not that dangerous to deal with these guys. It can be quite difficult for melee DPS to... The nerf is okay, but at the same time it wasn't that much of a difficult part of the dungeon. Now, surprisingly, none of the other trash mobs are getting changed. These were the only changes given to Azure Vaults when it came to trash. I think the couple of rings you have to go through, especially the first ring of trash, is quite the dangerous one, which surprisingly did not get changed. The bosses, or I should say the boss, is what gets changed. Azure Blade, the second boss of Azure Vault, gets nerfed. So, number 1, overwhelming energy damage is reduced by 25%, and the cast time is increased to 3 seconds instead of 2. Very simply, this is the ticking damage it does when he moves to the middle of the room and you have to deal with all of the adds channeling. So as you kill add by add by add, you are taking ticking damage. This ticking damage is now nerfed by 25%, and it's also going to happen 50% less often because it's going to happen every 3 seconds instead of every 2. So significantly reduced difficulty of this intermission phase of this boss, which was of course going to be miserable this week in Tyrannical if it was left unnerfed. Then there is a completely useless change. Ancient Orb damage is reduced by 25%. Normally, if you get hit by Ancient Orb, you get one shot. So nerfing it by 25%, it's not going to amount to that much. Perhaps before, if you started getting one shot at plus 11 keys, now you start getting one shot at plus 13 keys, because it gets nerfed by 25% in damage, but overall, not that big of a change. Then we have, not surprisingly, no nerfs to Court of Stars, as it was quite the manageable dungeon, so nothing has been touched in that old dungeon from Legion. What has been touched from dungeons from Legion is Halls of Valor. The Ebonclaw Wargs. So their problem was similar to the aggravated Skitterflies of Algethar Academy. They would turn to a random player and jump to them and do a whole bunch of damage. Basically the same thing those damn insects were doing in Academy. So that is getting nerfed by 20%. Then there is the nerf to Fenrir, or rather a quality of life visibility change. The Claw Frenzy, which is the one that does damage split amongst all players around him, now has a 1 second cast time and now has a visual effect to indicate that the damage it's going to inflict is going to be split to the targets in the area of effect. This might have been something some players were not aware of, for example range DPS, who for some reason never want to get close to the enemies, never want to get close to the bosses. They were afraid of this damage. Now maybe they might realize that it is more helpful for the group if you actually stack while Fenrir is doing that ability to help spreading the damage to all of the players, to make it easier for your healer to heal. We then have the biggest set of changes, and just pointing out this wall of text is hilarious, because this entire wall of text comes from a single pack of mobs. These are the packs of mobs before the third boss of the dungeon. You see how much stuff there is. You have nerfs to Deathbolt Volley, you have nerfs to Deathbolt, to Necrotic Eruption, Chant of the Dead, Swift Wind, Mortal Strike, Rotting Wind. That is just how miserable doing those trash packs was in Nokhud Offensive. They had so many things they were casting constantly. Your screen was constantly filled with things, filled with dark green, black orbs exploding. You had your soul ripped out of you every 5 seconds and you had to start running around trying to chase it. But then you had to be careful of the birds doing their frontals. So you had to wait for the frontals to be over to reach your soul. Other times your soul was right in the middle of the big AoE of the ground that you had to stay out of. And while all of this was happening, the tank was getting stacks of Mortal Strike on him. Mortal Strike reducing the healing on him for 10 seconds, making it even more miserable to try to tank this entire pack of mobs. Basically, nerfs across the board to this terrible set of trash mobs in Nokhud Offensive, and it was also more or less the main spot where you wanted to see nerfs in Nokhud Offensive. The first round of trash is also quite annoying before the first boss, especially because they don't move. They keep casting uninterruptible abilities with their bows non-stop, and it's quite hard to move them around, but besides that, it is mostly manageable. It was really just this set of trash before the third boss that was quite annoying to deal with. We have only one nerf in anticipation of this week's Tyrannical. Surprisingly, there is only one nerf to the Raging Tempest. One is that Energy Surge, which is the buff he gains for himself to smack the tank harder, now lasts for 8 seconds instead of 10, which is whatever, it's not that big of a deal. What is more of a deal is that Electrical Storm, so the very long 10-something second AoE it is going to do to the whole party, is now reduced by 15%. So slightly more manageable. I was expecting a slightly bigger nerf to this boss, which is going to remain the big check, DPS but also HPS check of the entire dungeon. It's going to be quite the difficult one still, even after this nerf. Now, after Nokhud Offensive, if you wanted to hear nerfs about a particular dungeon, the dungeon in question was definitely Ruby Life Pulse. So we start on the wrong foot because there is a nerf to Scorchlings no longer casting Burning Touch. Whatever, who cares? This was not the problem of the trash mobs of Ruby Life Pulse. Then we have Thunderhead and Flame Gullet, so the two big dragons flying around, the storm one and the fire one. are now visible from much further away, making their flight path easier to keep track of. The main problem with these two guys was the fact that they were sort of hidden between trees, and many tanks were ignoring their existence. They would walk past them, pull the next pack, and then these drakes would come out of nowhere, land down behind the group, aggro the group, and sandwich them with the pack they just pulled, and then wipe the entire group. That was generally the main strategy of these two drakes, to destroy your party. Now it's going to be made easier to keep track of them. Also, the cast time of these two drakes' breaths, the Storm Breath and the Flame Breath, is now increased to 3 seconds instead of 2 seconds, making it easier to move out of the way. Still not the main problem about these two drakes, it's more about the constant ticking AoE of the Flame Dragon and the two debuffs, the two ticking damage debuffs of the Storm Dragon that are more dangerous, less so about their breaths. Then there is also a change to the Flame Dance of the Flame Dancers, lasting a couple more seconds, and the Blazebound Destroyer's Living Bomb periodic damage reduced by 40%, together with the Lightning Storm of the Tempest Channeler damage reduced by 20%. Surprisingly, across the nerfs to all of this trash, there are no nerfs to Inferno. So the big fat AoE damage, which makes every pull around the ring before the second boss a miserable experience, is not actually getting changed. So you're still taking, even after these nerfs, full damage from the initial hit of Inferno and then the ticking damage of Inferno, which is what is likely still going to make these trash packs very dangerous. Less so this week on Tyrannical, but still, for the following weeks, it's going to be a miserable experience nonetheless. When it comes to bosses being nerfed, we have the second and third boss being nerfed. Kokia Blazehoof, the second boss, has 15% less health, and the Ad spawning, the Blazebound Firestorm spawning, has 20% less HP. Faster rotations between ads and boss damage overall with these HP nerfs. The last boss has a 10% flat HP nerf on both of them. Both of the humanoid and the dragon get 10% less HP. More importantly though, the dragon, Karaka, has less casts of Flame Spit. Flame Spit, the dangerous thing which will put Inferno Core, the dot around you that would spawn the pools on the ground. Now, when the dragon is grounded, he is no longer going to cast 5 of them, so 1 per player in the entire group, spawning 5 pools. Now it's only going to target a maximum of 3 players. So not only do you have to worry about less damage to heal or less damage to prevent as a player, but also less shit on the ground to dodge, to get rid of with the pools of fire spawning on the ground. So decent nerfs when it comes to bosses in RLP, less decent nerfs when it comes to trash mobs in Ruby Life Pools. It's also going to be interesting to see an unnerfed first boss in Ruby Life Pools, which is quite dangerous in Tyrannical and is not getting addressed by these changes. So I wonder if Blizzard will rectify this by next week with another round of nerfs to this dungeon, also hitting the first boss as well. We finish the set of nerfs with an old dungeon. We go back to Mist of Pandaria because Temple of the Jade Serpent gets nerfed. Depraved Mistweaver's Defiling Mist, so the ticking channel it would do to a single player, is now nerfed by 20%. This was awful in Fortified. God forbid you let this cast during Raging. This would usually kill you in 1 second. It would tick 2 times and the player was dead. So a 20% nerf is a good start. Perhaps it will need a bit more eventually. Also, Depraved Mistweaver's Touch of Ruin initial aura is now a curse effect. This is massive for players, for classes and specs that can use decurse. This is because the Touch of Ruin was the thing that would chunk your HP by like 80% and then put on top of that a heal absorb on you. So it was very, very dangerous. It would even one-shot people if this was cast during Raging, so very, very dangerous. But you could do nothing about it, because the initial cast on you was a ticking countdown for this effect to happen, but it was not dispellable. It was not a spell, it was not magical, it was not a curse, it was just a dungeon debuff. Now, this dungeon debuff turns into a curse. So this 3-second countdown before the damage actually comes and the health absorb actually comes can be dispelled immediately. So completely negate the mechanic whatsoever, making it quite valuable to have a decurse during that part of the dungeon. This, however, is the only set of nerfs to the trash in this dungeon, which is what is surprising. There are quite a few other mobs in there being quite dangerous, like on your way to the first boss there are quite some dangerous casts you have to interrupt or they hit like a track. Then you have of course the big large room where the third boss is, the Shah constantly spawning the small ones doing tons of damage. Those are not getting changed either, so surprising that this mob is the only one getting nerfed when it comes to trash packs in the dungeon. There is then only one boss getting nerfed, which is the last boss. The Wise Mari gets a hotfix, which we can look at as a nerf, because now it's going to be more easy to see the visibility of corrupt geysers, warning effects when you get to dodge the water basically without getting one shot, and also the visibility of where exactly is Wise Mari starting the wash away mechanics. So where is the water beam going to start from? That is a good change to the boss. But as for actual nerfs, the only change is to the Shout Out. Touch of nothingness damage is reduced by 20%. This is just the intermission damage when you have to deal with the ads, the copies of yourselves, and you keep taking ticking damage from the boss. This ticking damage is nerfed by 20%, which was not the problem of the fight. The problem of the fight is Wither Will, which is the double dot applied to 2 random players. This is what is going to cause groups to be unable to defeat this. If you don't have a second dispel to deal with this, other than your healers one, it's going to make continuing this fight extremely difficult. It is somewhat similar to Koltharok in Theater of Pain, when he would put the dot on 2 different players. The healer would dispel one, and then the second guy was in trouble. This was easily done by having, for example, a Holy Priest as a meta pick that could mass dispel, or by having something like a Destro Warlock being meta that could use their pet to dispel, so that was not that big of a deal. This expansion is going to be somewhat the same. You might need a second dispel to even consider defeating this boss in Tyrannical weeks at high keys, simply because of how much damage this mechanic will do, and because it doesn't seem like it is getting nerfed this reset at the very least. So these so far are all of the nerfs given to the dungeons. The TLDR of these nerfs is that for now it is definitely not enough. This is like a light coating of paint of nerfs to the dungeons. We need a few more, and we will likely have to go to a few more miserable resets where certain abilities are clearly overtuned, and Blizzard will be taking their time fixing them, because clearly some of the abilities that are going to brutalize the players have not really been touched so far, and the players are now continuing to scale up in item level, in gear. They are doing higher and higher keys, and they will start finding more and more of these mechanics hitting for harder and harder and being much more difficult to deal with. So I don't think we are anywhere near close the amount of tuning that will happen to these keys overall. If we have to be honest, okay, let's not just talk about nerfing the dungeons. If we have to be honest, dungeons like Court of Stars, and more importantly, dungeons like Shadowmoon Burial Grounds likely have to be buffed, likely have to be made harder in some parts. In particular, Burial Grounds at the moment is a joke. It's like not even a Mythic Plus dungeon, basically. So that is still something that also should probably happen. If I were Blizzard, I would also buff those dungeons up a little bit more, provided many of the other dungeons continue at least to get nerfed as well. So these are the changes for today, for Thursday. As I said, probably tomorrow or in a couple of days, once we have just enough data for this week, we will start looking at how the dungeons have been going in this reset with these new affixes, and also compare them to what we saw last week in terms of dungeons and in terms of difficulty of dungeons, etc, etc. But for today, we can stop just looking at and judging the changes that Blizzard brought forward for the dungeons. So as we stop here for today, of course, we start by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and supporting the channel itself and myself as well. You can still support in other ways that don't include you having to spend money. Liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself, are still perfectly fine ways to support. You can also follow me on Twitter if you want to get notified, for example, whenever I go live on my stream. That would be a good way to keep track of it, as well as, of course, directly on my own stream on Twitch. You can follow over there. I usually start streaming somewhere around 10 p.m. Central European time zones, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So if you want to pop by, just know I need some lab rats, I need some test subjects to speak to, as I am quite the talkative person, so having someone in chat I can constantly babble about as I stream is quite the helpful it's quite the helpful tool to have. So please, you're free to join. The menu for tonight is going to be some more raiding and a bunch more Mythic Plus keys as we talk about all of the changes happening this week. So with this out of the way, thank you guys of course for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, it looks like, I don't want to jinx it, but it looks like after 10 or so days I might have fixed my sleep schedule. Thank God.